discussion about land to you if you want to jump on. That's been a big goal of BDAB over the last couple of years.
Right. Well, at first I want to add something to the diversification discussion. You know, as I think it makes sense is OSU Cascades grows, and we're going to have these graduates. You know, hopefully to have industries that they can participate in and hopefully a lot of these people come in and graduate, stay in Bend, and become great citizens and participating economically. So, well, I mean, everybody, many of you know the history of Juniper Ridge better than I do, but you know, we've made it our priority and definitely to try to, you know, monitor and help that along in any way we can. It seems to make sense that we need to continue, if not work harder towards it at this time. A couple of reasons, obviously, for potential relocation of businesses in the 97 corridor. Are going to need places to go, and we don't want them to leave. We don't want to lose those jobs. And so having land ready and available for them as they're forced to move is definitely going to be a help. Obviously, we want to try to gain jobs and not lose them. So, you know, we have a couple different those businesses that are going to be forced to move in the area, and at the same time, hopefully attract new businesses into the area. And so there's the potential some of this money to attract businesses, whether it's helping them, you know, a new company coming into the area, or maybe even an existing company with a workforce that we want to retain, and helping them with SDC monies, maybe some or in other ways that they may need to move or move into the area or just move within the area.
Yeah, so on that point, that's EDCO's charge, right? In our biannual contract with them, working with traded sector businesses to recruit. So potentially, if these funds materialize, and depending at what level, EDCO could work to or BDAB could allocate a specific amount of funding to EDCO for business, paying down business SDCs for an industry that was either expanding or relocating to Bend in a kind of a core area. Core industry, excuse me. Keith touched on the business relocation program. I'd add under this one, and I think we mentioned it in that broader write-up, that there could potentially be actual policy discussions tied to this goal versus just allocation of funds. That's why Juniper Ridge Management Advisory Board is mentioned as another stakeholder in this one, in this action, in that we're starting to see some real momentum at Juniper Ridge, and you've seen that as counselors, and continuing to open up that area for more development and more employment land at a time where our employment land is fairly constrained, especially on the industrial side, may require some sort of policy changes, probably tied to that work with the Juniper Ridge Management Advisory Board. I did want to note a couple of questions for maybe more in-depth discussion. At the BDAB level, they've been talking about what the role of remote workers will be in all of these changes going forward. Certainly that's a big topic, and Councillor Piper and I were chatting last week around, I would broadly call it stabilization of our supply chain locally, right? We do not have a whole lot of freight access into Central Oregon. Is that something we can explore with BDAB? And maybe something to consider as well, and nest under this goal. So happy to answer questions or take your feedback. No.
Looks like Bruce has a hand up.
Yep, Ben, I've got a question. I appreciate that. So I am acutely aware of the editorial of the bulletin this morning, and I'm supportive of this kind. I mean, this whole high level issue of, you know, is it government's role, and or is government any good at sort of picking winners and losers? And so one of my questions is, how much strings are attached to these CRF dollars? And so I guess my question is, how much of them are we almost sort of more pass through in the sense that these are funds that are already earmarked, by the feds or the state, and we're simply distributing them, versus how much do we actually have influence over what types of industries we want to see here? Because so I'm gonna be really clear. I'm totally supportive of this. I think we may need to do a little bit more thinking on how this is presented and how it's fleshed out.
Sure. And on the notion of how these CRF dollars are allocated, I think it's been a bit of a mishmash so far. We've seen some with some real guardrails around them, and then we know that there's other funds that we're just kind of waiting for the state to give us some more guidance around how they want to see that money trickle down to municipalities and counties and the like. So, and I didn't realize there was that's always a nerve-wracking thing when you hear about an editorial you haven't read yet that pertains to what you're presenting on. But I haven't seen that. I did just open it. But my sense is money, especially on the economic development side, is going to flow down in many cases through Business Oregon, and they're going to put guardrails around how it can be used. That's what we've seen so far. But there could be broader, more general fund style CRF dollars as well. And I think I saw Eric unmute to maybe touch on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to just say, and Eric Kanzler will talk next, but I just want to put things into perspective. We're talking, as I said earlier, maybe 2.6 million that might be available. So these aren't going to be complete game changers in terms of resources available. And there's a lot of, as you'll see from these presentations, there's a lot we're trying to accomplish here. I think it's going to be, this is more sort of future phases of potential stimulus dollars. So if there's funds that help us get infrastructure, I think, we just need to see as Keith talked about, land available. A lot of the barriers to getting more land available to diversify our economy is it's the basics. It's making sure that we can get roads to serve that land. So to the extent that we can articulate that in a plan, then we might be successful at getting obtaining some of those stimulus dollars. So I want to maybe put it into perspective. I don't see us being in a position to start picking one industry over the other. I think it's really what we want to do is set the table for a variety of industries to flourish. And we typically do that by investing in infrastructure and land use so that the market, because I think it's become really dangerous for us to, the industries are changing really quickly, and we want to be really cautious. So I agree a lot with the sentiment that was expressed. I did read the editorial this morning. I thought it was fair in terms of making sure that we don't get too deep into that area and get outside of our role of those basic services that we provide.
So that's it. Keith, was there anything else you wanted to touch on before we moved on to Shelley's goal?
No, I mean, I could, should I talk a little bit general about the BDAB, what we're planning on doing,
Sure.
Just like
for a minute.
Yeah, well, just like council is re-looking at goals and stuff. BDAB will also look at its 3-year strategic plan. We're going to obviously keep in, one of our focuses was the availability of lands, employment lands. So that will obviously stay as a goal. And, we'll just, in our next meeting, we're probably going to start hashing out what we think, business needs and where our changes need to go and come from. We're also addressing the DEI as well at the BDAB. Stuff as well. So we're just kind of working along, and we know it's going to be fluid changes.
All right, that's it from us. Thanks, Keith.
Great, thanks.
Okay, Karina, go ahead. Next slide. Okay, so good afternoon, counselors. Shelley Smith here, Senior Management Analyst. So what we really tried to do is pull from existing council goals, public safety, homelessness, and mental health partnerships, which is goal number 3. And then goal number 4, which is effective and efficient city operations and the diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I'm really pulling it under supporting vulnerable populations with an equity framework. I think as we look at what's happened in our community, we realize that, COVID has had a disproportional impact on traditionally vulnerable and marginalized communities. And when we look at the impact there, what we want to do is to strengthen the safety nets with our nonprofit partners and with the county. We had many meetings with Deschutes County through the EOC and through the JIC and many other crossovers around, aligning quickly with the pandemic and making sure that each group in our community was well-resourced and that the needs were expressed. And so that partnership, although not maybe in the same traditional meeting, when and where we're meeting, we're still very connected and working on how do we identify what those issues are, how do we respond, and then how do we respond with opportunity in the future as funding becomes available. So this plan really in your meeting packet goes over some of the things that we'd like to focus on. The first is making sure that we stay consistent in providing the basic necessities that we are right now. So those basic hygiene needs for food and, encouraging and supporting the motel allocations for those who are high risk or symptomatic with COVID or are COVID positive. And then how do we look forward and see what are opportunities that we could have to strengthen those safety nets and those resources? So in the project objectives within your packets, you'll see that we're really looking at, again, continuing the partnerships, looking towards nonprofits who are experts in this area and learning from them what we can do with this additional funding to help support their important and vital work. And then what do we do for, through the equity lens that the state has come up with, how do we use communications and resources we have with communication tools to make sure that everybody in our community has the information that is needed. So whether it's translation of documents, whether it's how we create trauma-informed language around that information, and then how do we provide that information on multiple platforms. Some of the other ways that we're looking at is continuing the contracts we have. We have some contracts established with local nonprofits to ensure that critical service delivery occurs. Those are currently held with REACH for case management and Family Kitchen for food and meals to go. Another area we looked at is, continuing that facilitated conversation with you around land use and infrastructure opportunities with long-term managed camps for the unsheltered. That could be the legislative advocacy. It could be continuing the emergency declaration language to give us some additional leeway. And then what would grant funding do to help leverage those opportunities? The last two are really, again, leveraging the partnership we have with Deschutes County with nonprofits and looking to them to help us identify what those needs are and help deploy those funds in partnership so that we don't overstep or we don't duplicate our efforts as we move forward in these different opportunities that come up with financial supports. And then the last is really...
Shelley, are we looking at the right slide?
Yeah. I'm reading off of the project template or the planning document that's in your packet. Okay. And so ensuring that, we move forward with any type of citywide collaborative effort, shared governance, and some of the community DEI conversations for further framework building. So really, how we would know this was a success is that we would see those partnerships strong and being able to identify and leverage those limited resources, that we would be supporting that inclusive communication resource that I just mentioned, and that we would continue to fund or pursue funding and make sure that it's distributed equitably. So I think for council actions is looking over this goal and seeing if this fits, and then continue to advocate for funding initiatives and legislative opportunities. So those are the highlights of the vulnerable population supports.
So what I'd like to do, unless there's any other questions for Shelley on the work plan, and again, all that detail is in your packet. So our intention is to move forward with that. It's in a sense, like as we might be potentially applying for grants. A lot of the language that you're seeing in those work plans would be that foundation we'd use to help position us to get access to these funds. So with more, but I want to make sure that you understand some of the background and sort of the twisty, windy path to get these funds through the community relief or the CRF funds. So Eric Kanzler is here to give you a little bit of background information on that, as well as what to expect in this upcoming legislative session and how that might all intersect. So Eric, if you could join us now. I don't think there's any presentation or PowerPoint, but just he'll walk through the high points.
Great. Can you hear me? All
Yeah,
right.
we can hear you just fine.
All right. Thank you, Eric. So let's start with two things in particular. The general outline of how the state is looking at coronavirus relief funding, the CRF funds, and what we're looking at in terms of how the state is, what sort of special sessions are we going to have, including tomorrow, and how is the emergency board and the Ways and Means Committee making determinations. So starting with the basics of the CRF funding, Oregon was allocated $1.6 billion in its entirety with coronavirus relief funds from the Federal CARES Act. $250 million of that was in the form of direct allocations to the local governments that were 500,000 people and greater. That's Multnomah County, the city of Portland, and Washington County, which really means that the state has 1.38 or 1.39 billion to do some fairly broad things with. The federal guidance that we have with that doesn't require that the state give local governments any money necessarily. It does strongly suggest, however, that the state should give local governments statewide funding, and it suggests what the upper limit on that funding ought to be, which is about 45% of the state's allocation. So really, if the state was following the federal guidance, about $640 million or so would go out in the form of direct upfront allocations to local governments to do a variety of things with. Primarily, in terms of city or county or even special district budgets, what you can't use CRF funds for is backfilling revenue loss due to COVID-19 related impacts. What you can do is account for increased costs associated with services provided to assist the community with COVID-specific responses, and you can, as a local government, grant significant portions of that money out to address a wide array of impacts, including public health and economic supports that are needed in the community. So far, the state has only awarded $200 million, and they basically do this by establishing something called a federal funds expenditure limitation. So the legislature or the emergency board, which is basically what the Ways and Means Budget Committee is outside of a legislative session, they've essentially said, local governments, you guys have $200 million, the governor will direct that funding. Thus far, the governor has said, we're going to prioritize public health and we're going to deprioritize economic support. So we were given a first stab at articulating and seeking reimbursement for our costs. We have not been given a direct allocation yet. What we've done so far is amounted to about $50 million of that first $200 million being spent. And that was to cities and counties who chose to seek reimbursement for public health only related expenses between March 1st and May 15th. I think that was maybe $220,000 for us. And then, as Eric alluded to, there is a larger amount that we expect coming to us from the remainder of that $200 million. It will be distributed for the full range of Treasury guidance, which means public health and economic support can be used to grant out to the community. And we expect, based on everything that I've heard, to get about $2.6 million from that. Now, in speaking with Sharon and also Tracy Stabler on the budget accounting side of things, my understanding is that our projected increase in COVID-related expenses for the period in question, which is March 1st through December 30th is up to about $2.7 million. I think it's, Eric, you may have a more recent update.
Yeah, and I would say that's more in alignment, more at about $1 million. There was some costs associated with potentially code enforcement and other things that we will not be. We just didn't know when we were putting those estimates together. I think a more realistic COVID related. So these are things like masks or face coverings, are just facility modifications that we have had to make and that we will continue to make. And then some, what is eligible is some of the overtime for public safety. So again, you can't backfill revenue, but if there's some things that are driving your costs that are COVID related, those are eligible. I think the $1 million might be aggressive. I think it's probably something less than that in the couple of $100,000 range. So we think that there's a sizable amount of that 2.6 million that would be available to provide that economic support and some of the activities that we talked about just here earlier with this goal.
Okay, thank you. That was my suspicion. I knew that the 2.7 or $2.7 million estimate was very aggressive. On the one hand, we were trying to capture as many direct costs as possible given the budget shortfall that the city is looking to be facing. But what that does mean is out of the 2.6 million, if we only spend about $1 million or so on direct city budget costs, we have a fair amount of money in that initial tranche of funding to grant out to the community. The state, I would say, has done a pretty effective job of directing or of determining that it is going to soon direct funding for certain public health and individual and family supports. There's going to be, they've now put out the full or agreed to put out the full 38 million for childcare, even though we'll need more than that. They've agreed to put out 75 million for rental assistance. The legislature is deliberating on some additional funding and is mostly going to be focusing on individuals, families, public health, and that sort of thing. What the legislature has not done a lot of thus far is delineate how it intends to offer economic supports at the state level. At the last e-board meeting, which was last week, or maybe it was the week before, there was about 75 million that they had earmarked for economic support that was pulled back because the political support to pass that was lacking. There was actually a little bit of concern that Business Oregon may not be the best delivery mechanism, at least not through a lot of programs that it presently has. So what we're hoping for, I think, is a very strong additional allocation of CRF funding to local governments. Certainly, we're going to ask for another $200 million statewide, which presumably would mean another 2.6 or roughly that for Bend. And honestly, if we're asking for the full 600 some odd million that the federal government has basically said the state could give us if it wanted to, then we'd be looking at another 5 to 5.5 million for the city of Bend. So at that point, we would have the ability, based on everything that we've heard, to determine whether we wanted to do a public health focus, whether we wanted to do an economic development focus, whether we wanted to blend all of those supports. And I think one of the things we would likely be expected to take into account is, what has the state done already? What has the state not done already? So if the state has put a robust amount of money in rental assistance, it's not necessarily expected that local governments are going to use the money for that. If the state's not putting money into economic support, I think it's expected that we will put the bulk of our granting resources into economic support. So we're working very hard. That 2.6 million, it still has not been allocated. It's been agreed to by legislative leadership and AOC and LOC and SDAO and some others. We fully expect that we will get that money. Beyond that involves a much larger political conversation. But really, if we're covering the bulk of our direct cost from a city budget with a portion of that first 2.6, the rest of that is predominantly, if not entirely, going to have to go for community grants. And the best way to advocate to the state legislature to get that money is to say, hey, look, we have the community partnerships established with the chamber, with EDCO, with Neighbor Impact, with whoever the relevant community partners are, and honestly present to them a community first approach. And so that's what we actually did. We helped the chamber and Neighbor Impact and Deschutes County United Way chapter penned a joint letter in support of getting money basically to the city so they could partner with us. I took that letter in with some local city lobbyist partners and county lobbyist partners. We've turned that into a statewide letter that has the state chambers and OWIDA and bankers and credit unions and a whole bunch of other people saying, look, local governments know their communities. They have the partnerships. We need the resources at the local level because we know what to do with them and we're ready to go. So that case is being made right now for the remainder of the CRF dollars. And honestly, there are, I think someone told me there was about 46 sources of funding through CARES. CRF is just one of them. But as far as we're concerned, it's the lion's share of the resources that we could hopefully receive. And it's the one that gives us a lot of discretion at the local level to determine how to use it. So tremendous flexibility to be as creative and as collaborative as we want within the Treasury guidance, which is pretty expansive in terms of community partnerships. So that's my rundown of the CRF in terms of the politics and the details. Eric, I don't know if we want to take time for questions.
Yeah, maybe let's take a pause for questions just on that topic before we talk about the legislative session.
Yeah, I have one question. One, you've answered my question about the advocacy and the joint letter of partners and communicating, from the voice of the city and the community. Can you let me know when that was delivered and then what the process is for follow-up and what additional advocacy may be needed to support that?
Sure. Thank you, Councillor. So we submitted, I shouldn't say we, I think it was Katie Brooks ultimately that submitted that letter to Leah Horner, the Governor's Economic Development and Regional Solutions Director, about a month ago. Okay. And from what little I know, the Governor's office has been pretty tight-lipped, but I think that that letter was very timely. Honestly, I think we were the only local government to have engaged our partnership and delivered a letter of that nature. In terms of what we can do to follow up on that, I think that we've established a very good relationship with Leah in the Governor's office and continuing to give, because like I said before, it's the legislature that establishes the sidebars, but it's ultimately the governor who directs the funds. So the most important point of confidence for us is to have a governor saying, cities are telling us how they're going to use these funds in a way that we're confident in. Thus far, Bend is one of the only cities that has done that. So I think we're helping to fill a void. And what I've decided to do in consultation with Eric King and the city manager's office and staff, of course, is to try to leverage that local effort into a statewide effort. And we're seeing, I had to lobby LOC to make this a priority, frankly. And we brought AOC in and we brought other mid-sized city lobbyists in, and we're really trying, Eric has got a meeting scheduled with some other city managers and mid-sized city lobbyists to figure out how we can be more effective and flank LOC. I think to the extent that the city of Bend and the work you guys are doing on DEI, frankly, and community partnerships is the best thing that we can do, is to let the state and the governor's office know how innovative we are, how inclusive we are, how collaborative we are, and to give them faith that city governments aren't just local bureaucracies, that we are true and essential community partners. And we're standing there, when Eric has heard me say this ad nauseum, when we show up and Councillor Piper, you too, I know we've talked about this.
Yes, we have.
When we show up as a bureaucracy, we only get so far. We can handle a lot of technical issues and our internal needs and whatnot, but when it comes to advocating for the needs of the community needs to be there with us. And this conversation, I don't know how long it's going to take for a lot of the things that you're talking about to shake out, but this is exactly the sort of innovative local effort that the state is really needing to hear right now.
Okay. Thank you, Eric.
Eric, this is less a question than a comment. I was on a conversation. Were you on the conversation yesterday with Annette Leva and around housing? So Molly Heiss, when Neighbor Impact was there, they got several million. I want to say be like $2.5 to $3.5 million for rental assistance. And a lot of the larger employers on that call were not aware of that, and it was like, okay, I'm going to have my HR person get a hold of you. So that's good news. If nothing else, it sounds like that might count as sort of that's a significant investment in housing, which would mean we could then move it to other areas that were also priorities for our community.
Yeah. Yeah, so knowing that, I think it's important for all of the community partners, certainly the city, if we're playing a point role in terms of engaging with the state to determine what the nature of the allocations are going to be. But assuming we do get a significant CRF allocation and more than 2.6 million ultimately, we'll need to know from Neighbor Impact and other community-based interests that we're going to partner with, what have they already received in terms of CARES funding that's not through CRF, but is through some other funding stream, so that we can complement and augment that.
All right, but let's go ahead and move on to the legislative session that's now, I think is it been called to order, or that's tomorrow?
Tomorrow morning. So this has been long awaited. We had, of course, this is a very weird year for me. In odd years, the session meets for 5 months. In even years, it meets for 5 weeks. Both long and short sessions require a significant ramp up time of many months before that, but usually you finish a short session the first week of March, and then it's kind of a downtime for March, April, May, June, and then it ramps up again. This year is backwards. The Republicans walked out of the short session, so we think passed 3 bills during the regularly scheduled session, and we've been waiting for a special session to address a lot of different things, that most of which we couldn't have even have anticipated in the regularly scheduled session, and of course that's COVID. So tomorrow we're finally going to get the first of what is anticipated to be several, potentially 3 special sessions, and the theme of the session that's going to begin tomorrow, we don't know how long it's going to go, is there's a couple themes. One is police accountability. Another is coronavirus response. A third is going to be individual assistance and family assistance priorities, for example, emergency shelter siting and investments and things of that nature. Then there's other topics that are going to be thrown in as well, forestry and wildfire ahead of the wildfire season, and a smattering of things here and there. The governor has called this special session. Usually the governor only calls a special session when legislative leadership, including Democrats and Republicans, have met and determined a course, not just to convene the session, but to conclude the session. The last thing you want is to call a special session that ends in a political logjam, because in Oregon, a special session that's called by the governor does not have an end date. It can be open-ended, and nobody wants that. So I expect that while they would like to get in and out in a single day, they won't. I expect we'll be in session for a few days, maybe 2 or 3. It's impossible to say. And for the most part, the bills are decided upon already. And there will be some coronavirus relief decisions. I honestly don't know if the legislature is going to ratify the initial 200 million allocation where we would get 2.6 million from. I hope that they will do that. If they don't, it would probably be a subsequent session. It's rumored that we're going to have a second session potentially as early as July. Boy, it's hard to put a wager on any of these things, but so we'll have one starting tomorrow at 8 a.m. It'll probably last a few days, and staff has had a chance to review all of the legislative concepts, and we've got some comments putting in. And I think we'll have 2 more. And there's a couple critical things that the legislature is going to be keying off of as they determine when to have additional special sessions and how to structure them. The first is that they're going to wait for the September revenue forecast. We all know that the May forecast was dire and predicted, I believe, a projection, a drop of about 2.7 or $2.9 billion for the remainder of the current biennium at the state level. They've also projected a decrease from previous expectations of about $4.5 billion for the 21 to 23 biennium. So by one strain of logic, they're going to wait until after they know what their refined revenue forecast looks like before making a number of important budgetary decisions. And they're probably going to hold some funds in reserve until they have a clearer picture in September, which is, of course, frustrating to those of us at the local level that know what our local needs are and would like to see that money now. That just seems to be the tenor of the state wanting to hold that money a little bit longer. Not every state has done that, frankly. In Washington, for example, Governor Inslee sent $300 million straight out to the local governments. That didn't happen here. The second thing that the state legislature is going to key off of is, this was discussed before, is Congress going to do another round of coronavirus, of basically another CARES package? Are they going to do another, or not another, but any infrastructure funding package? And if they are interested in either, are they going to do them together? I just heard from Senator Merkley's office this morning that they fully expect that legislation that's passed or is on the verge of passing in both the House and the Senate on infrastructure funding is likely to undergo a reconciliation effort where the Senate and the House try to work out a massive infrastructure package together that would be predominantly focused on surface transportation. Of course, it's up to them to determine what the makeup of that will be. And conversations have been underway for quite some time about additional congressional relief above and beyond what we've received from CARES, and in particular, a focus on local government revenue backfill. This is all speculation, of course, and nothing can be guaranteed, but remember, that's what we can't use the existing CRF for, no matter how much we get. Even if we get $5 to $7 million and hit the upper threshold of what we're theoretically allowed to get, we are not allowed under federal guidance to use it to backfill lost revenue. And so right now, we're really dependent in that regard on future action from Congress. So there's only so much that the state is going to be willing to do now in light of the uncertainties in the ongoing revenue forecasts and uncertainties with Congress and what they're going to do or not. Last point, and then I'll open it up for questions. The 2021 legislative session is, I've only been doing this for about a decade or so, but it's going to be unlike anything we've ever seen before. There, of course, was a budget readjustment after the housing bubble burst. This is a whole new level. So the entire session is going to be about budget reallocation and how we're going to pare budgets down. And on the one hand, that sounds really dire for local governments and for certain critical services, and it is in most regards. But what will be valued above and beyond everything else, in my opinion, and I'm not alone in thinking this, is the emergence of creative partnerships. Can local governments, for example, demonstrate an ability to partner with their community and make limited resources go further? I'd say, while we are not going to have an endless amount of money to attempt to vie for, local partnerships are going to be worth their weight in gold, where we can come up and be convincing with them. So I think a long-term focus on that work is absolutely in order. That's my opinion on next year's long session. So I'll leave it at that for now and see what questions you guys have.
Eric, I've got a quick question. I think you sort of alluded to it, and maybe it's not a known thing. So obviously, the big player in here is the K through 12 school system, but so that's obviously not being tackled in this first special session. Do you have a sense of when that next special session is going to happen, or am I hearing you say that it might not happen until after September? And when in September is that next revenue forecast?
The best answer that I could give you right now, and I'll pre-qualify this by saying I've never seen so much uncertainty, nor have I seen as much of a dynamic where really three people in the state are calling the shots on their own terms. They're holding, the governor, the House, Speaker of the House, and the Senate President are holding everything close to the vest. I've never seen so many seasoned lobbyists, far more veteran than I am, have so little clue. But what we're hearing is, we're going to do this first round here. We are likely going to have a follow-up session in July where additional funding allocations are made Frankly, I'm not sure what the logic is behind that. The September forecast won't officially be released till about mid-September. So if they are going to key off of that, it'd be late September.
Okay, but so late September for, it sounds like a third, so it sounds like you do think there will be a second special session in late July where they may make some preliminary stuff, but it won't be substantive because ultimately it's at risk of changing when the revenue forecast comes anyway.
Yeah, I think that's the reality right now, and there's quite a bit of tension. A lot of people think that the May revenue forecast was unrealistically dire, at least in retrospect, and that things aren't as bad as we thought they would be then. So you have competing visions about the legitimacy or the, you know, the ability, you know, how good was that crystal ball?
And I want to take this opportunity to maybe just identify a real kind of issue and challenge that's kind of before us, and probably, you know, it's really across the country, but I know we felt it. It's been a problem here historically, and that's lack of childcare. And as I was talking with incoming Superintendent Lauren Norquist and Don Horton yesterday, we have monthly coordination meetings with schools and parks. You know, I think we're all kind of there's still some confusing guidelines coming out of the state on what does particularly elementary school look like. I think middle and high school, there's probably opportunities for that hybrid in-class distant learning and back and forth. But for elementary school age children, that's much more challenging to do that. And so if that's based on some of these guidelines of it's, you know, per square foot for a student, et cetera, and or certain amount of distance with kids, depending on your interpretation of that, it could mean, you know, huge difference between having 11 kids in a classroom versus having 24. And then how do you handle that? And so all that said, I think childcare is going to continue to be a really pressing need as we look towards the fall. And so just wanted to alert the counselors to that issue, and that some of the funds that, you know, the funds that are available, I was just talking with Shelley, I think we've way overspent the 2.6. There's so many needs for those funds, but I just want to clue in that that need for this fall, because our economic recovery is going to be dependent upon our workforce, particularly our service sector workforce that doesn't have the option to work from home. So a lot of folks can kind of balance some of those things, albeit very difficult to balance childcare and working from home and all that. But certain parts of our economy, especially the service sector, does not have that option. So how do we really beef up our childcare when we are already at a deficit? And then with this sort of uncertainty with schools and how they're going to manage this. I mean, their plans are going to come out in the next couple of weeks. So we'll know more, but I think it's just important to flag that issue right now.
Hi, Eric. It's nice to see you. How are you?
Good.
Yeah, nice to see you too.
And our other Eric.
Sorry, you weren't talking about me. Eric,
yeah, no, sorry, King, get out.
She probably sees you all the time.
Not in person anymore. Hey, I have been waiting on, we thought we might get some essentially legislative relief from our own city code that would allow us to establish a permanent camp for folks that don't have houses. Am I hearing you correctly? That wouldn't be this emergency session, but that might come up in the session in July. Am I right about? Please.
Actually, my expectation is this is going to happen in two phases. You may recall it was House Bill 4001 during the regular scheduled short session. It would have basically done two things for us in terms of getting shelters sited and avoiding regulatory, local and state imposed regulatory burdens as well. So it would have basically given us a year window during which we have a temporary regulatory regime that would allow an expedited approval process on much simpler terms. We would take health, public health and safety and very basic things into consideration. But I mean, to be quite honest, the legislative intent was to avoid appeals from neighbors. Now, it did not it wasn't a rubber stamping of a shelter anywhere in the city. Local governments still have some discretion, but it gave us a pretty clear ability to get those things moving. So it also allocated would have allocated $2.5 million to the city of Bend for a navigation center / shelter in some form to be determined. The way that they're approaching it now is tomorrow in this short session, they intend to pass a light version of 4001 and give us a 90-day window during which that regulatory burden would be lifted, not a year. And the reason is that there has been negotiations between the Democrats and Republicans about what's appropriate for a special session. And a lot of folks, and I'd say primarily the Republicans, who broadly supported 4001 in the short session said, well, this is a special session. This is an emergency session. Let's do 90 days. And, you know, one could surmise they may have attempted to not show up if they didn't get that point conceded. So for one reason or another, I expect tomorrow or one of the next couple of days that legislation will pass with that 90-day window, and we need to be ready to jump on that. I'm actually working on a technical fix to try to ensure we can utilize that full 90-degree window. I don't know that I need to go into detail about what that technical fix is, but just so you know, we're fully invested in getting everything we can out of that opportunity, and Bend and our planning staff is leading the charge. A lot of times, to be quite honest with you, Bend's planning staff has found problems with statewide legislation that the agencies and the league and the other cities haven't found. So I am very hopeful we will get that 90-day window passed soon, and that from there in July, my understanding is we're still lined up to get that $2.5 million. The problem is it was a tight time frame, even if we got that money in February. Now we're not getting it in June. Now we're hoping to get it in July. If we want beds in place by the winter, that's a quick turnaround. And I'm sure Scott Cooper is pulling his hair out over limited time frame and the uncertainty associated with that. But I have every expectation that we are still in line for that 2.5 million, and hopefully we get it next month.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, and while I don't even know if Shelley's still on this call, but while I was completely freaked out by the editorial that I hadn't read either, I scrolled by. Everyone at Juniper Ridge was relocated without our having to physically evict anyone. Eric and Shelley and Jaime and our amazing officers really deserve congratulations on that. Shelley and everyone.
Oh, thank you. I'll let Shelley speak if you want to provide any other updates on that. But thank you.
Well, I think the good news is that our team worked very well with everyone out there and the service providers. So Jaime and Keisha get all the credit for their amazing work in helping folks move. So thank you.
Thank you all. And thank you, Eric. Eric with a K.
You're welcome. Yeah. With a new mustache. I like it, Eric.
It's temporary. My daughter convinced me to shave off my beard for the first time in 8 years and goaded me into leaving the mustache for a couple days. So,
Well, I think the 49 event was a great touch.
thank you. So, you know, I know my involvement in this here is basically informational for this event, and it's just really kind of a lowdown on a lot of relevant things. Obviously, to the extent that I can be valuable in helping this larger conversation about DER and community partnership useful at the state level, I would be thrilled to be able to play that role, because I think it potentially is one of the biggest political assets we could have going for us.
Yeah, thank you. And so, Eric, I mean, that you were able to see our presentation of how we are framing this together. I just maybe a question to you. Do you feel like we are positioned based on all the information you have from the state so that we can optimize our opportunities for additional funding? Is there anything missing, basically?
The framework is all there. The challenge, of course, is in executing and knowing on what timeline you need to execute. We're getting very little warning about when to do what. And I'm faced with some situations where I don't know if we need to respond the next day or we have a month to respond. And that's really challenging, not just from, being effective as your lobbyist, but also not wanting to overtax staff resources when you don't know, am I asking you or suggesting you guys do a whole lot of things that turns out we didn't need until a month later. I would say we have, the thing to do right now is to just go with what we have. Let's see how this legislative session goes, and let's see how it concludes. Let's recap what they did, what's next on tap. And I think, Eric, we've got this regular twice a week check-in with certain staff, and we have a weekly check-in with our delegation. I'd say we should be ready to prioritize this work strategically as soon as this first special session concludes, and see what staff is capable of pulling out. I just know that everywhere we come up with a city-led community partnered narrative, it's gonna pay dividends.
Thank you for that, Eric. Any other questions before we move on to the next agenda item of Eric on the legislative items?
No, I just appreciate the time, Eric, and wish you all the best in Salem, and looking forward to continued updates. And however we can help, reach out.
Sounds good. My pleasure.
All right, so the last item on the agenda was just an update on our continuing work with diversity, equity, and inclusion planning. So just to recap, the council goal had 4 objectives attached to it. That 2 were focused internally and 2 externally. So the 2 internal were training that for the most part we've accomplished some baseline training. There's still more work to be done, but we've done the initial sort of high-level training with our departments. And then the second internal piece was an organizational assessment, which we've completed. We're in the process of reviewing and distributing that information. And that is really the intent of that is to help provide a baseline of data as well as a sort of a springboard for a more detailed internal plan. And on the external front, there was sort of a 2-step process. One was to establish a short-term task force that would help us really scope out the work of a more permanent DEI commission or committee. So that is the second piece, is as a permanent committee that would help provide some oversight in this arena. And so with the events that have happened over the last month or so, I think there's really a need to think maybe a little differently, maybe I would say kind of a bigger impact. What can we do beyond just forming a committee from a city perspective? Because as you all know, our city services fall into 3 categories: public safety, infrastructure, and community and economic development. So I know a lot of the concerns in the community, as we've talked about issues of racial justice, go beyond just what the services that the city provides, and go into sort of issues of education with our youth, go into just bigger community issues. And so as we've been having some conversations with community groups, we've recently met with the Fathers Group. It's a group of mainly black men that have really put in a focus on how to improve the education system and the experience as parents of children of color, and the struggle that folks have in Bend, and just understanding that in a more sort of detailed way. I think that we've sort of caught in pieces of it, but understanding kind of the struggles and how do we put together a framework at a community level to be responsive. And so let's take this idea of a city committee and maybe elevate it a bit. So we've had just some beginning discussions, and I think just some general, like, yeah, let's think bigger picture and where this might all go. And as you know, we've contracted with Allyship and Action to do the work assigned, those 4 kind of strategies that I've outlined earlier. And so they've developed a group of folks that have helped with the short-term task force to help build towards what this committee would look like. And so we're kind of just repositioning that work a bit to see about what we call as a shared governance model or collective impact, as we talked about with this group. is there a way to amplify our voices and work more collaboratively with school district, library, park district, and others to coordinate some potential funding and programming? And really, I think ultimately what we wanted to see is increased accountability as well at many different levels. And so those conversations started. As I mentioned, I met with the school board and or school district and park district, the leaders of those organizations, and talked about this sort of concept. Very much supportive of it. And I think when I mentioned this to Laura Norquist, she said, "Oh, like the better together kind of model. That's a model that education has used." And if you're curious, Bruce might be a better person to kind of give some background on that. But there are models out there of kind of working across those governmental entities on the topic. So what that looks like is still very much in formation. We have opportunity this week to continue that conversation. Tomorrow we have a meeting with, as I mentioned, the shared governance concept that we've talked about with this group. COIC is facilitating that at 11 o'clock. And then right following that meeting, we have this continued DEI conversation with the Fathers Group that started a few weeks ago. And so the counselors that are participating on that include Councillor Abernathy, Jenna Goodman-Campbell, and Mayor Russell. We know that we're just starting these conversations. So the hope is that there's some convergence and we start building that collective model here over the next weeks and months. So we wanted to continue to use this subcommittee as a touch point to help shape it. So I thought I'd let me pause there and see if there's any questions. And I can maybe talk a little bit more about next steps after that. So questions, anybody?
So Eric, yeah, this is Chris. So it sounds like what I'm hearing, which is great movement and obviously a heavy lift, but an important lift, as we all agree. So it sounds like this week there's a lot of activity going on. So would the activity that the meetings and so forth that are taking place, would all that be funneled back to the Stewardship Committee for review and then recommendation to actually begin building, this model, the shared governance and, trying to figure out how to work more effectively with the agencies? I know we even talked about this and in depth even before COVID-19 and, the current situation that unfortunate situation that happened with Mr. Floyd and so forth and what's going on now in our city. So I just wanted to get clarification on that for thinking ahead.
Yes, exactly. And so and it's on our website when we talk about what's the definition of the Stewardship Subcommittee and their role, it really is that those partnerships that I started explaining at the start of this meeting. And we see, as we were scoping out all the opportunities for collective impact or shared governance, that we had listed diversity, equity, this is, as you said months ago, diversity, equity, inclusion, climate action planning, homelessness, mental health, partnerships. There's a whole sort of richness of ideas of where to go. Yeah. We felt like we've got this conversation that's really started to percolate and kind of our council goal planning and the work with allyship and what's occurred and some community interest, and let's try to put these pieces together and put a focus right now. So let's not try to one thing at a time, because I think we're more effective if we can kind of pick one of these topics and really dive a little bit deeper. And there was a lot of general support for this idea that we would all contribute some funding to help fund some sort of effort. And as we're starting, allyship has done a lot of base research, and so we're looking at amending the contract to help us kind of fine tune this and really put some proposals together. I would like to use the Stewardship Subcommittee to for us as a city to help participate, but knowing that this isn't we're not the only ones driving this. This is something that we'll all have to work together. But the Stewardship Subcommittee to me would be a good place to kind of really fine tune. And of course, we want to make sure that we continue to inform the full council. So we've got that support of the full body as we shape these plans.
Okay, thank you.
Eric, let me just weigh in, and I feel very fortunate I'm on both of those calls tomorrow. The way that I still see it is kind of the shared governance is the umbrella. It's sort of the philosophy. It's the approach. How do we how do we provide services in a community in a more efficient and more effective manner. DEI, we've gotten a head start because we've already done the work with Allyship in Action, and a lot of the questions and even hopefully some of the answers have already been percolated. And so is that how you envision it?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Okay. So Chris, going back to your point, I think it would be really valuable for me, and because neither Jenna or Sally are here, are there any either concerns that you have, or if you think about it, I mean, sort of as city representatives going into negotiations, as it were, I mean, hopefully this will be able to create a win-win coming out of this, but are there any either concerns that you definitely want or things that you don't want? And then while you're thinking about that, Chris, going back to what Eric said, to me, I think one of the things that we're going to need to be thinking about is what are those things that we want to happen, i.e., what kinds of things would need funding for specific programs, activities, but also what are those things that we don't want to happen? And that's where it seems to me a lot of the push so far, at least on the short-term DEI committee, has been around some type of a citizen review board or something along those lines. And it's not clear to me sort of how that would fit in with other entities or whether that's something we need to take on ourselves. So I'm just throwing that out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, one thing that maybe just, and we were doing some brainstorming with the school district and park district about it, is maybe this vision would be a separate nonprofit that would help us develop systems of accountability for the school district, for the city. So it's going to look a little different about what does that accountability look like from a law enforcement perspective versus in the classroom, or from the administrative perspective. And so having that expertise in that body to help define it, create kind of a community plan, but then have sort of guidance for the public agencies to create the things that are specific to the services that we offer, and making sure that accountability is there.
Great, I like that idea a lot. Barb and Chris, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, exactly. All about the accountability and getting those defined. And I think realizing that, agencies operate differently, but trying to find, ways that we can collaborate together and share those resources, I think is really important. So I'm looking forward to seeing what comes back. I think the one thing that is still on my radar is really determining, a committee versus commission, and what does that mean, and what are the values of each, or is it what are the importance of either, and do we have both, or do we just have one, like we talked about, just in terms of just having committee, because that's consistent with what we have within the city.
And I might actually ask Mary Winters, I know she's on the call. We had some follow-up conversations with Allyship, so that I think what you're bringing up from our last subcommittee meeting around committee versus commission, we have since had some conversations. So maybe Mary, if you or Shelley, if you want to kind of get the council subcommittee up to date as to some of the thinking around that.
Yeah, hi. And I think we had a good conversation with them. And I think one thing that they emphasized, which was a good point, that they had a lot of recommendations that were consistent with everything the city's trying to do. And we maybe got over-focused on that one piece of their recommendation, and to not get too sidetracked down that path. But they do understand the concern that whatever you call it, the creating a body for private rights of action is a different step. And where I think we left it is they understand that from Ben's staff and probably council perspective, we don't know what the need is for that. What they would like to do is to not completely take it off the table for the future, to not say, oh, no, we don't need to do that in Ben, we're good. But to say, maybe if we form, whether it's an outside nonprofit instead of a city committee, whatever we form, we keep exploring whether that is a body and a need in our city. And if so, what would it be empowered to do? But not right now, but keep it on the discussion as one of the things we are going to talk about seriously. I hope I'm explaining what both of our understandings were. Does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
Yeah,
It makes sense?
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sure does. Thank you, Mary.
Any other questions or clarification on this topic? Okay, I think that was all the items that we had for you today. I just wanted to remind council that July 15th meeting is our quarterly update, where we will be asking for formal action on the remodeling of the council goals to add the COVID-related items and some of the shared governance and other pieces that we've talked about in more detail on June 3rd. And then we'll just continue to keep you all informed as this conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion planning goes and the shared governance model. So as we get notes from the meeting that's happening, that's occurring later this week, we'll be sure to share that with this group or any sort of follow-up items. And I would envision, especially with the council election and turnover coming, we're going to want to think about how to deploy council liaisons in these efforts to make sure that there's long-term sustainability. So as we all know, Bruce is not running again, so we'll be needing to think about how to best make sure there's that consistency with these efforts moving forward. And that's it. So if anybody wants to call for adjournment, I don't know who that might be.
Move to adjourn.
Bye.
Yeah.
Everybody,
All right.
thank you.
All right. See ya.
See you.
Bruce, you get, when you're sitting right there, you get some pretty fabulous horns coming up out of your head.
Me?
No, Bruce.
Oh, Bruce. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Perfect.
It's a
You know,
lamp.
or an angel. It looks like maybe an angel too.
I know if we got to see the whole thing, it might be a halo, but no, he's only showing us the horns.
Never a
I'm just
halo.
concerned about my glare here, so.
Good
Have a
luck
good one.
tomorrow, Eric Kane.
Oh, I see. Yeah, look at, there they are. They're the horns.
All right. See you guys. Bye.
Good night.
The oh, for heaven's sake, come on.